World War I was over. After suffering 117,000 American lives, the country was ready for a new, prosperous age. Welcome to the roaring 1920s.
A. Automobiles. By 1920, Henry Ford's Model T had been in production for about 12 years. His company, the Ford Motor Company, was known for using the assembly line to make products quicker and at a lower cost. The 1920s also brought the era of more expensive cars, like the Rolls-Royce, Buick, and Cadillac. As more cars were being used, parts like the glass and brakes became more reliable. B. Babe Ruth. After being traded from the Red Sox, Babe Ruth began his 15-year career with the Yankees in 1920. He became famous for his extraordinary number of home runs, 714 throughout his entire career.
I've been away from you a long time. I never thought I'd miss you so.
C. Charles Lindbergh. In 1919, Raymond Ortiz offered a $25,000 reward for whoever was the first to fly non-stop from New York to Paris. Lindbergh took that challenge. He took off after much preparation on the morning of May 20th, 1927. 33 hours and 30 minutes later, Lindbergh was able to claim that prize. D. Dance fads and marathons. Dancing and dance marathons made up a majority of social events and outings during the 1920s. The attitude of the time was generally carefree, and as women began wearing shorter hairstyles and shorter skirts, dance classes like the waltz and foxtrot were complemented with the tango, the black bottom, the jitterbug, the Baltimore bus, and of course, the infamous Charleston. E. Equality for women. The fight for equal rights for women celebrated a great victory in 1920. On August 26th, the 19th Amendment was finally ratified, and after years of struggling for suffrage, all American women finally technically had the rights and responsibilities equal to male citizens, namely the right to vote. F. Fashion. Fashion in the 1920s was very distinct. The flapper look was very popular among women, which was characterized by short bob haircuts, dresses with shorter skirts, drop waists, more shapeless fits, boyish silhouettes, stockings, crochet hats, heels that were at least 2 inches high, and expensive makeup. As for men's fashion, the early 20s brought high-waisted jackets, thin lapels, and narrow trousers. Children's fashion also began to develop during this decade. It was at this time that blue and pink first began being associated with boys and girls. Furthermore, clothing that was more suitable for play, such as bloomers, sailor suits, rompers, play suits, and overalls became wardrobe staples for children. G. Great Depression. The start of the Great Depression, the economic slump that would last up to the start of the Second World War, is said to have officially started when the stock market crashed on October 29, 1929, also known as Black Tuesday. However, the long-term causes leading up to the Depression have been slowly taking effect on the country's economy for years. Over-speculation, the breakdown of international trade, unsustainable credit, over-investment, central banking decisions, too much debt, and the failure of several large industries led to the market crash, which in turn led to large public bank failure, widespread panic, and runs of local. H. Hoover. Herbert Hoover was the 31st President of the United States. He served from 1929 to 1933. The crash of 29 occurred less than 8 months after the start of his term. Since none of Hoover's efforts to produce economic recovery proved to be successful, he is now ranked very poorly among former U.S. presidents. In fact, Hoover was so disliked by the American people, especially the poor, that during the Great Depression, the shanty towns built by the homeless were called Hoovervilles. I. Insulin. After years of collaborative research between Charles Best, Frederick Banting, J.J.R. McLeod, and James Collett, Best discovered in the spring of 1923 how to extract insulin, but the samples weren't pure. With the help of the drug firm Eli Lilly and Company, large quantities of refined insulin could be produced. When the Nobel Prize was awarded in 1923, only Banting and McLeod were accredited. Both decided to share their prizes with Best and Collett. The foreman's work helped treat diabetics who previously faced an inevitable untimely death due to their disease. J. Jazz. The jazz music craze really fit in with the mindset of the decade. The music was upbeat and lively and allowed for all the wild dances and flapper outfits that became so signature of the Roaring '20s. Jazz music became increasingly popular with the speakeasies where dance, music, and of course drinks were the main attractions. Paul Whitman and Louis Armstrong were the reigning kings of jazz, changing music forever with their innovative combinations of music using instruments and vocalized sounds instead of traditional lyrics. Jazz music largely originated from the Harlem Renaissance. K. The Ku Klux Klan. The 1920s and into the 30s was the period of time in which the KKK by far had their highest membership. The Klan grew rapidly across the South and Midwest, especially in urbanizing cities such as Memphis, Atlanta, and Dallas. Most members were lower to middle-class whites who were fighting out of hatred and fear of losing their jobs to blacks, immigrants, or other minorities. Klansmen began targeting Jews, Catholics, communists, socialists, and other immigrants as well as blacks. The social unrest after the war and the economic stress during the Depression sparked the second phase of the KKK. It was also during the 1920s that the burning cross became a symbol of intimidation for the Klan. L. Lost Generation. The Lost Generation is a term that generally refers to the group of artists who lived in Paris after World War I. Now famous authors such as Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, and T.S. Eliot were all members of the so-called Lost Generation that was rebelling against what America had become. M. Mickey Mouse. In the late 1920s, the Disney Studios began considering a replacement for Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, a fairly popular cartoon who was receiving less and less financial support. In the spring of 1928, Disney began working on new character ideas. Mortimer Mouse, who was ultimately dubbed Mickey Mouse, was supposedly inspired by a pet mouse Walt Disney used to have on his farm. Mickey's first successful cartoon, Steamboat Willie, was released on November 18, 1928. Walt Disney himself was the original voice of Mickey Mouse. Another cartoon, The Opry House, released on March 28, 1929, introduced Mickey as we know him today with his white glove. N. Negro National League. The Negro National League was founded when organized baseball in the United States was segregated. The NNL was established on February 13, 1920, by a group of teen owners led by Rube Foster. This was the first African-American league to achieve stability that lasted more than just one season through controversies over umpiring, scheduling, and corruption. Although the NNL fell apart in 1931 due to the economic stress of the Great Depression, new leagues were formed in 1933 and 1937. O. Organized crime. Gangsters like Al Capone became household names after the influence of organized crime rings during the 1920s. The Mafia and other crime rings provided large sums of money during a time when jobs were becoming scarce. Coincidentally, Prohibition provided the perfect market for the gangsters. Even though the sale, manufacture, and transportation of alcohol became illegal, there was still an incredible demand for alcoholic products. Criminal gangs fought each other for control of the trade and sale of the alcohol, which was supplied to the public at incredibly inflated prices. Violence and corruption steadily increased as the mobsters bribed government officials and police officers. Ironically, Prohibition sparked the illegal trade that spread to other markets as gangsters began to take advantage of their newfound wealth. T. Prohibition. Prohibition was the period of United States history when there was a national ban on the sale and manufacture and even transportation of alcohol. It was instituted when the 18th Amendment came into effect on January 17, 1920, and existed up until 1933. Prohibition successfully managed to stimulate underground markets, widespread criminal activity, and corruption as Americans refused to take the amendment seriously and would bribe government officials who found out about undercover bars or saloons. Q. Quiff. A quiff is a slang term from the 1920s that referred to a promiscuous kind of woman. A more general and common term for this type of woman is the flapper. Flappers were notorious for going against acceptable behavior. They wore shorter skirts, bobbed hair, listened to jazz, wore excessive makeup, drank, danced, smoked, drove, and tended to treat sex in a more casual manner than what was the norm of the time. Flappers and their carefree outlook on life have become symbolic of the Roaring Twenties. However, after the Wall Street crash in 1929 and the official start of the Great Depression, there was no place for the flapper lifestyle, so their culture fell by the wayside to the economic hardship of the time. R. Radio. Although the concept of transmitting radio waves had been around since the 1800s, by 1920, radio signals could be transmitted and received with notable clarity. The first public radio broadcasting station opened in Pittsburgh in 1920. The station was an instant success and sparked the formation of many other stations by 1922. Radio is a cheap, quick way for people to hear about news and world affairs, and later they added entertainment and sponsors into the mix. The radio soon became a central part of the American household. S. Scopes Trial. The Scopes Trial, officially known as the State of Tennessee versus Scopes, occurred in 1925 when a high school biology teacher, John Scopes, was accused of violating the Butler Act, which made it illegal to teach evolution. Scopes was found guilty, but the verdict was later overturned on a technicality and was never brought back for another trial. However, the trial still attracted national publicity, especially to get coverage of the respected lawyers such as prosecutor William Jennings Bryan and defense attorney Clarence Darrow. The trial represented the struggle of separation of church and state in schools as well as in the law. T. Teapot Dome Scandal. The Teapot Dome scandal was the greatest scandal of its time. During Warren G. Harding's presidency, Secretary of the Interior Albert B. Fall leased Navy petroleum reserves at Teapot Dome at very low rates and without competitive bidding. By 1922, Senator Thomas Walsh began an intensive investigation. A committee was finally able to find evidence of the illegal records and leases the to incredible convict in amount of immigrants 1927. and migrants Fall raised and a large his cohorts population were that sentenced to resulted time in a in wide prison array and of signed goods, large services, sums of and money. establishments. The
In
prosperity,
1929, after they were
opportunity, and
convicted
lifestyle
of bribery.
the cities offered
This scandal
drew
greatly
both foreigners
damaged the
and rural
reputation of the
citizens
Harding
alike.
administration.
Born of parents fine, drank the best Italian wine.
Z. Vanzetti and Sacco. On August 23, 1927, Ferdinando Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were executed. They were convicted of murdering two men during a 1920 armed robbery in South Braintree, Massachusetts. The case was highly publicized and still remains a controversy among historians today because of the nature of the trial. Vanzetti and Sacco were Italian immigrants, and also were found to have been anarchists. Their undeniable background and views were thought to have influenced the outcome of their case, especially because there was shaky evidence that would have normally not been enough. W. Warren Harding dies. Harding's health had been declining significantly since the fall of 1922. He began to experience severe fatigue and chest pains that radiated down his left arm. By 1923, Harding's career as president wasn't going well either, and even though he had expressed his desire to run for a second term, the criticism of his administration seemed to be too much. Just as his health seemed to be improving, Harding died suddenly on August 2, 1923, while he was visiting San Francisco. Calvin Coolidge, Harding's vice president, assumed the presidency. Coolidge was elected for a full term in 1924 and was able to restore a sense of confidence in the White House after the scandals of Harding's administration. X. Xenophobia. Following the Red Scare and Palmer raids, many Americans still experienced xenophobia, or the irrational fear of foreigners. Many weren't willing to share their rights with people they considered to be different, and they were also scared that the influx of immigrants might take jobs away from people that were born in the U.S. In 1921, Congress even went so far as to pass the Emergency Quota Act, a policy that closed American doors to most immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. The unrest in Russia mixed with the resurgence of the KKK created a fear and hatred towards foreigners, even though America has always been proud to be a nation of immigrants. Y. Yo-yo. Although the yo-yo was a toy that has been used since 500 BC in ancient Greece, the fad did not take root in America until 1928, when Pedro Flores, a Filipino-American, opened the yo-yo manufacturing company in California. By November of 1929, Flores opened 2 other factories so that he could produce 300,000 yo-yos daily. Z. Zozzled. Zozzled was slang used for expressing how drunk someone was. The 1920s was a generally carefree time in which people took to drinking heavily, even though the sale of alcohol was illegal under Prohibition. People turned to speakeasies, bootlegging, organized illegal activity, black markets, and whatever bribery needed to be able to drink and keep the police from reporting them.
Ha! Stop! Well, there you have it. A to Z of the Roaring 20s.